Don't you want to sleep in the guest room? My family needs the master bedroom, my husband Richard insisted with that condescending smile I'd grown to recognize. I stared at the cramped living room couch where he'd already placed my pillow and a thin blanket. His family was arriving for a week-long stay, and somehow I, the person whose name was actually on the deed, had been relegated to sleeping arrangements usually reserved for unexpected overnight guests. I never imagined at 32 that I'd be questioning my place in my own home, but as I watched Richard rearrange my belongings without my permission, I realized this wasn't just about sleeping arrangements. It was about power, respect, and a marriage where I had slowly become a guest in the house that I owned long before I ever met him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of suitcases being dragged across hardwood floors woke me that Saturday morning. I stretched, momentarily disoriented as sunlight streamed through unfamiliar windows. I wasn't in my bedroom. Instead, I had fallen asleep in my home office, after working late on a proposal for my architecture firm. The digital clock on my desk read 8:17 a.m., earlier than I'd normally wake on a weekend, but much later than Richard typically started his day. "There you are," Richard's voice came from the doorway. "I've been looking all over. My parents' flight landed early." I sat up quickly, smoothing my rumpled clothes. "They're here already? I thought they weren't arriving until this afternoon." "Change of plans. Dad got them on an earlier flight. They're downstairs with Aunt Meredith and Uncle Paul." Richard looked immaculate in his pressed button-down and tailored slacks, making my wrinkled blouse and yesterday's makeup feel all the more disheveled. "You might want to freshen up before joining us." The subtle criticism in his tone was familiar. Not harsh enough to protest, but clear enough to sting. I'd grown accustomed to these small remarks over our 3 years of marriage. "Of course, I'll just take a quick shower and join you." I stood, gathering my notes from the desk. I didn't realize Meredith and Paul were coming too. Last minute. Addition. Mom wanted the whole family together, Richard explained, checking his watch impatiently. "Also, I've moved your things from our bedroom." I paused, my hand on the doorknob. "You've what?" "Your clothes and toiletries. I've moved them to the guest bathroom downstairs," Richard continued, as if discussing nothing more significant than a furniture rearrangement. "My parents will take our bedroom, Meredith and Paul will use the main guest room, and my brother will arrive tomorrow for the guest suite in the basement." "And where exactly am I supposed to sleep?" I asked, though the sinking feeling in my stomach suggested I already knew the answer. Richard gestured vaguely toward the living room. "The couch pulls out. It's just for a week, Sophia. My parents aren't as young as they used to be. They need the comfort of a proper bed. You understand?" In fact, I didn't understand. My architecture firm had finally secured the Henderson project after months of negotiations, and I had critical design revisions due in 5 days. A week of broken sleep on our lumpy pull-out couch would devastate my productivity during this crucial period, something Richard was well aware of. "Richard, I have the Henderson presentation this week. I need proper rest. Why not have your brother take the couch? Or we could give your parents the guest room and keep our bedroom." His expression hardened slightly. "My parents deserve the master suite. Dad's back has been bothering him, and our mattress is the best in the house." There was a finality in his tone that I recognized. The conversation was over in his mind. "They've done so much for us, Sophia. The least we can do is make them comfortable during their visit." The subtle manipulation was expertly deployed, positioning my reasonable request as selfishness against his parents' comfort. It was a tactic I'd encountered with increasing frequency in our marriage, especially when it came to his family. "Fine," I conceded, too exhausted from my all-night work session to argue further. "I'll make it work." Richard's smile returned instantly, warm and approving. "That's my girl. I knew you'd understand." He kissed my cheek quickly. Hurry down when you're ready. Mom's made her famous breakfast casserole. After he left, I stood motionless in my office, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't the first time Richard had prioritized his family's comfort over mine, but it was perhaps the most blatant example, and it came at the worst possible moment. Professionally, I gathered my toiletries from the downstairs bathroom where Richard had relocated them, squeezed between cleaning supplies in the narrow cabinet under the sink, and took a quick shower. By the time I joined the family in the kitchen, they were already halfway through breakfast. "Here she is," Richard's mother Eleanor announced as I entered. "We thought you might sleep all day." "Sorry to keep everyone waiting," I replied, forcing a smile. "I was working late on a project." "On a Friday night?" Uncle Paul shook his head disapprovingly. "Richard tells us you've been working too." "Much. All these late nights can't be good for starting a family." I felt my smile freeze in place. Starting a family had been a point of tension between Richard and me for months. At 32, I wanted to establish my career before having children, while Richard at 36 was increasingly vocal about not waiting too long. "The Henderson project is a significant opportunity for my firm," I explained, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "It's temporary intensity, not a permanent schedule." "Still, dear," Eleanor interjected, "a woman's most important project is her family. Everything else is just supplementary." Richard nodded in agreement, placing a possessive hand on my shoulder. "I keep telling her the same thing, Mom, but you know how stubborn Sophia can be about her little buildings." My little buildings had secured our financial stability when Richard's investment venture had collapsed 18 months ago, but I swallowed the reminder along with a bitter sip of coffee. Correcting him in front of his family would only create tension during their stay. After breakfast, I retreated to my office to continue working on the Henderson designs, but concentration proved impossible with the constant interruptions. Every hour seemed to bring a new request. Could I show Aunt Meredith where the extra towels were kept? Would I mind running to the store for Eleanor's specific brand of tea? Richard needed my help setting up the entertainment system for everyone to watch family videos. By evening, I had accomplished almost nothing. As I closed my laptop in frustration, Richard appeared at my office door. "Sophia, could you help Mom with dinner? She's making her pot roast and can't find some of the utensils." I took a deep breath. "Richard, I've barely made any progress today. The Henderson presentation is still days away," he finished for me. "My family is here now. Your work can wait." "My work paid for this house," I reminded him quietly, immediately regretting the words when I saw his expression darken. "Are we really going to do this again?" he asked, his voice lowering. "I thought we agreed that what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. Or does that only apply when it benefits you?" The accusation stung precisely because it inverted the reality of our situation. The house had been mine before our marriage, purchased with an inheritance from my grandmother and years of saving while I established my career. Richard had moved in after our wedding, bringing little more than his clothes and a few pieces of furniture. His financial contribution to our household had been minimal since his business setback, though I had never held this against him. "That's not fair," I began, but Richard cut me off. "What's not fair is making my family feel unwelcome in our home. They've traveled all this way to see us. The least you could do is show some hospitality." The conversation followed a familiar pattern. My legitimate concerns transformed into character flaws. The focus shifted from his actions to my supposed selfishness. By the time Eleanor called up that dinner was ready, I had somehow been maneuvered into apologizing for prioritizing work over family time. Dinner was a performance of false harmony. I smiled at the right moments, laughed at Paul's outdated jokes, and complimented Eleanor's cooking, all while acutely aware that in a few hours, everyone would retire to comfortable beds while I prepared the living room couch that Richard hadn't even bothered to pull out yet. after helping clean the kitchen, a task that somehow fell entirely to me while Richard entertained his family with stories in the living room. I finally excused myself to prepare my makeshift bed. The pull-out mechanism was stiff from disuse, and the mattress, once extended, revealed a prominent depression in the center that promised uncomfortable sleep. As I was arranging sheets over the thin mattress, Eleanor entered the living room. "Oh my," she said, watching me struggle with the bedding. "Richard mentioned you were sleeping down here, but I had no idea the circumstances were so primitive." Her tone suggested concern, but her eyes held something closer to satisfaction. In the 3 years I'd known her, Eleanor had never quite disguised her belief that her son had married beneath his station. Never mind that my career was more stable and successful than Richard's had ever been. "It's only temporary," I replied, smoothing the sheets with more force than necessary. Eleanor approached, adjusting the pillow I had just positioned. "You know, dear, when I was newly married, I would never have allowed Walter's comfort to be compromised in our home. A man needs his rest to face the world." "Richard isn't sleeping here," I clarified. "I am, so he can give you and Walter the master bedroom." "Oh," Eleanor's surprise seemed genuine. "Richard told us you had insisted on this arrangement because you often work late and didn't want to disturb him." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Richard displaced me from my own bedroom, but he had twisted the narrative to make it appear as my choice, painting himself as the accommodating husband rather than the architect of my discomfort. There must have been some misunderstanding. I managed, my voice tight. Eleanor patted my arm condescendingly. "Relationships require sacrifice, dear. Though perhaps if you focused more on being a wife and less on being an architect, these little misunderstandings wouldn't happen so frequently." After she left, I sat on the edge of the uncomfortable pull-out bed, my thoughts racing. This wasn't just about sleeping arrangements or even about Richard's family. It was about a pattern of behavior that had become increasingly impossible to ignore, one where my needs, my work, and even my home were treated as secondary to Richard's priorities. The most troubling realization, as I prepared for a night of broken sleep on a couch in the house that I owned, was that I had been complicit in this arrangement. Through small concessions that seemed reasonable in isolation, but formed a troubling pattern in aggregate, I had allowed my position to be slowly eroded. As I lay awake that night, listening to the muffled laughter from the kitchen where Richard was still entertaining his family with a late-night snack, I made a decision. This situation wasn't just about enduring a week of discomfort. It was about reclaiming my place, not just in my home, but in my marriage and my life. The Henderson presentation wasn't for 5 days, but another, more important presentation had just taken priority, showing my husband exactly whose house he had asked me to leave. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sleep eluded me that night. The pull-out mattress dipped uncomfortably in the middle, creating a valley that made any position painful after a few minutes. From upstairs, I could hear muffled laughter and footsteps as Richard and his family moved between rooms well past midnight. The thin blanket Richard had provided barely kept the chill at bay, and by 5:30 a.m., I abandoned any pretense of rest. I quietly folded the sofa bed and restored the living room to its daytime appearance, erasing evidence of my displacement before the family awoke. In the kitchen, I brewed a strong pot of coffee and opened my laptop. If I couldn't sleep, I could at least make progress on the Henderson designs. The house was mine in every legal sense. I had purchased it 3 years before meeting Richard, using the inheritance from my grandmother, combined with savings from my first major architectural commission. The 3-bedroom Craftsman, with its spacious office and south-facing windows, had been my dream home, and I had spent weekends restoring its original hardwood floors and updating the kitchen myself. When Richard and I married, he had moved in with little more than his clothing and personal items. His business was struggling even then, though he had painted a more optimistic picture during our courtship. Within 6 months of our wedding, his investment firm had collapsed entirely, leaving him financially dependent on my stable income. I had never held this against him. Marriage meant supporting each other through difficulties, and I believed his promises of rebuilding his business. But sitting in the cool morning light of the kitchen he had barred me from sleeping above, I confronted an uncomfortable truth. Richard's financial dependence had gradually transformed into a different kind of power dynamic. One where he compensated for his lack of financial contribution by asserting control in other ways. "You're up early." The voice startled me. Richard's father, Walter, stood in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in pressed khakis and a polo shirt, despite the early hour. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted, closing my laptop. "The couch isn't the most comfortable." Walter nodded sympathetically as he poured himself coffee. "Richard mentioned you insisted on giving up your bedroom." "Very generous of you." There it was again, the narrative Richard had constructed to mask the reality of our situation. I considered correcting Walter's misconception but decided against it. Any disagreement would be reported back to Richard, likely twisted into another example of my supposed hostility toward his family. "How is retirement treating you?" I asked instead, changing the subject. Walter launched into a detailed account of his golf game and the condo he and Eleanor had purchased in Arizona. As he spoke, I observed the confident ease with which he occupied space, my space. He opened cabinets without hesitation, rearranged items on the counter to his liking, interrupted my work without apology. It was the behavior of someone who felt entitled to ownership, a quality I recognized in his son as well. By 7 a.m., the rest of the family had descended to the kitchen. Eleanor immediately took command of breakfast preparations, gently but firmly pushing me aside from the stove where I had begun making eggs. "Let me handle this, dear," she insisted. "You're clearly exhausted from your uncomfortable night. Perhaps you should freshen up before breakfast." The suggestion that I needed to freshen up in my own kitchen before eating breakfast, that I would likely prepare myself, carried the sting of Eleanor's perpetual disapproval. In her eyes, I never quite measured up to the standards expected of Richard's wife, a sentiment she expressed through these small, seemingly helpful comments. "Actually," I said, reclaiming the spatula, "I was about to make my grandmother's Spanish omelet recipe. It was her specialty." Eleanor's smile tightened. "Well, the family is used to my breakfast casserole when we're together. Perhaps another time." Before I could respond, Richard entered the kitchen and wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders. "Mom's casserole is tradition, Sophia. You'll love it." The erasure was so casual, so complete, that for a moment I could only stare at them. Not only had my cooking been dismissed, but Richard had positioned me as an outsider to his family's traditions, someone who would love Eleanor's casserole upon trying it, as if I hadn't endured it during every previous family gathering. "Actually, I've had it several times," I corrected quietly. Richard waved this away. "You've never had it freshly made in our home. It's completely different." Our home. The phrase rang hollow given my current sleeping arrangements. I excused myself to shower in the downstairs bathroom, now cluttered with Uncle Paul's electric razor and Aunt Meredith's extensive collection of facial products. My own toiletries had been pushed to the back of the cabinet, some items relocated, to make room for the visitors. When I returned to the kitchen, breakfast was in full swing. My place at the table, the seat by the window where I had taken my morning coffee for 5 years, was occupied by Aunt Meredith. The only available chair was a folding seat that Richard must have brought up from the basement, placed at the corner of the table like an afterthought. The conversation flowed around me, centered on family memories and inside jokes from before my time. Whenever I attempted to contribute, my comments were acknowledged briefly before the discussion returned to its previous trajectory. By the time Eleanor served her famous casserole, a bland combination of eggs, white bread, and processed cheese that she proudly declared a family secret recipe. I had effectively faded into the background of my own kitchen. "Sophia," Eleanor addressed me suddenly. "Richard tells us you have an important presentation this week. Something about a Henderson?" "Yes," I replied, surprised by her interest. "Henderson Development has commissioned our firm to design their new headquarters. It's a significant project: sustainable construction, community integration, adaptive reuse of a historic building." "Sounds time-consuming," Walter commented between bites. "Hard to balance that kind of work with family responsibilities." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "We were just saying to Richard last night, weren't we, dear, that at your age career ambitions need to be tempered with family planning. These biological clocks don't tick forever." Richard had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but he didn't contradict his mother. "We've been discussing options," he said vaguely. "I wasn't aware we had moved beyond discussion to sharing those discussions with extended family," I replied, keeping my tone light despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. An awkward silence fell over the table. Richard cleared his throat. "Sophia's just a bit sensitive about her work-life balance right now. The Henderson project has her working crazy hours. Which is precisely why adequate rest is essential," I added, meeting his gaze directly. "Proper sleep in a real bed makes a significant difference in cognitive function." Richard's expression hardened slightly at the implicit criticism. "We all make sacrifices for family, don't we?" The loaded question hung in the air. What sacrifices had Richard made lately? Moving his wife to a pull-out couch? Taking credit for the home she had purchased? Undermining her professional commitments for his family's comfort? Before I could respond, Richard's phone rang. He checked the screen and stood quickly. "I need to take this business call." As he left the room, I noticed Eleanor and Walter exchange knowing glances. Richard had been vague about his professional activities lately, claiming to be rebuilding his network and exploring opportunities. These mysterious business calls had become more frequent, though they rarely seemed to result in actual income. "Richard works so hard," Eleanor sighed after he left. "Always has. Even as a boy, he was so ambitious." I bit back the observation that ambition without results was just wishful thinking. Instead, I began clearing dishes from the table, needing physical activity to channel my growing frustration. "Let me help," Aunt Meredith offered, following me to the sink with a stack of plates. As we stood side by side rinsing dishes, she spoke quietly. "Men can be territorial creatures, can't they? Even in spaces that aren't technically theirs." The comment caught me off guard. Was this sympathy from an unexpected quarter? "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Meredith shrugged. "Paul was the same way when we first married. Moved into my apartment but rearranged everything like he owned the place. Took me 3 years to reclaim my own closet space." She glanced to ensure we weren't overheard. "Richard's father did the same to Eleanor, from what I gather. Some family patterns run deep." The observation was astute and unexpectedly forthright. For the first time since their arrival, I felt a genuine connection with one of Richard's relatives. "How did you handle it?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Directly," Meredith replied, a small smile playing at her lips. "When the confusion about what belongs to whom becomes problematic, sometimes clarity is the only cure." She handed me the last plate. "You have a lovely home, Sophia. I've always admired how you've designed the space." The simple acknowledgement that this was my home, my design, felt like the first honest interaction I'd had in days. I was about to thank her when Richard returned from his call, his expression animated. "Great news," he announced to the room. "That was Tom Edwards from Vanguard Capital. They're interested in my proposal for a new investment fund. We're meeting tomorrow to discuss terms." The family erupted in congratulations. Walter clapped his son on the back, and Eleanor beamed with pride. I maintained a supportive smile, while mentally calculating how many similar great opportunities had materialized in the past year, only to dissolve upon closer examination. "We should celebrate," Richard continued. "I'm thinking of hosting a small dinner party tomorrow night. Tom and his wife, maybe a few other potential investors. Show them our beautiful home, impress them with our hospitality." Our beautiful home, our hospitality. The casual appropriation of my property and labor was breathtaking in its presumption. "Tomorrow night?" I questioned. "Richard, my Henderson presentation is still days away," he finished for me. "This is happening now, Sophia. It's important." "So is my presentation," I countered. "I need that time to finalize the designs." Richard pulled me aside, lowering his voice to avoid his family overhearing. "This could be my big break. After all the support I've given to your career, can't you support mine for one evening?" The selective memory was staggering. My career had supported us both financially for years, while Richard's support had largely consisted of taking credit for my achievements in social settings. "Of course I support you," I replied carefully. "But hosting a dinner party requires preparation and energy that I need to direct toward Henderson right now. Perhaps we could schedule it for next weekend instead." Richard's expression darkened. "Tom is available tomorrow. These opportunities don't wait for convenient timing. Sophia, I need you to be flexible here." Flexible. The word that had become code for sacrificing my needs to accommodate his wants. How many times had I been flexible while Richard remained rigidly committed to his preferences? Before I could respond, Eleanor joined our hushed conversation. "Is everything all right? Richard, your father and I would be happy to help with any entertaining. Your mother still knows how to host a proper dinner party." Richard brightened immediately. "Mom, that would be perfect. Sophia is concerned about her work commitments, but with your help, we could make it work." And just like that, I had been maneuvered into a dinner party I didn't want, in my home that I couldn't properly use, to support Richard's business opportunity that would likely evaporate like all the others before it. All while being positioned as the reluctant participant rather than the person whose legitimate concerns were being ignored. As Richard and Eleanor began planning the menu, discussing which of my dishes and linens would be suitable for properly impressing his business, "Contact," Meredith caught my eye from across the room. She gave me a knowing look that seemed to say, "Clarity is the only cure." She was right. The time for accommodation and flexibility had passed. I needed to reclaim not just my physical space, but my agency within my marriage. And perhaps Richard's dinner party would provide the perfect opportunity for the clarity we both desperately needed. Sunday morning brought a flurry of activity to my house as Eleanor took command of dinner party preparations. Despite my protests that we should keep the gathering small and manageable, the guest list had somehow expanded to include not just Tom Edwards and his wife, but 3 other potential investors and their spouses, plus Richard's brother Daniel, who would arrive that afternoon. "We'll need to rearrange the dining room," Eleanor announced after breakfast, eyeing my carefully curated space with a critical gaze. "The table configuration isn't conducive to proper conversation flow." I watched in growing dismay as she directed Richard and Walter to move my antique walnut dining table, a restoration piece I had spent months refinishing, away from the windows where I had specifically positioned it to capture the evening light. "Actually," I interjected, "I designed the dining room layout intentionally. The current arrangement frames the garden view and optimizes the natural lighting." Eleanor smiled the particular smile she reserved for tolerating what she considered my professional eccentricities. "Dear, I've hosted hundreds of business dinners over the years. While your artistic sensibilities are charming, Richard needs a practical arrangement that facilitates networking. The view is secondary to function." "Mom's right," Richard and I added, already pushing my table toward the center of the room. Tom Edwards is old school. He appreciates traditional formality in business settings. The dismissal of my expertise, in design, in my own home, was so commonplace that I almost let it pass unchallenged, but Meredith's words about clarity echoed in my mind. The current layout was designed by an award-winning architect, I said, my voice firmer than usual. One who specifically accounts for both aesthetics and function in every design decision. Richard paused, recognizing my tone. Sophia, we're just trying to help make this evening successful. By ignoring my professional expertise in my own home? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its directness. Eleanor broke the tension with a dismissive laugh. Such sensitivity. Richard always said you were passionate about your little projects. But tonight isn't about showcasing your design skills, dear. It's about Richard's business opportunity. Little projects. The Henderson development was a $50 million contract that would transform an abandoned industrial district into a sustainable mixed-use community. My firm had beaten out international competitors for the commission. Yet in Eleanor's framing, my work remained a hobby, something cute but inconsequential compared to Richard's perpetually imminent business breakthrough. I took a deliberate breath, choosing my next words carefully. The Henderson project will appear in Architectural Digest next spring. My little projects have supported this household for the past 3 years. I believe that earns my design decisions some respect. Walter cleared his throat awkwardly while Eleanor's smile froze. Richard stepped toward me, lowering his voice. Could we discuss this privately? In the kitchen, Richard's carefully maintained composure slipped. What are you doing? He demanded. My parents are trying to help us. They're helping you, I corrected, while actively undermining me. And you're allowing it. They have decades of experience hosting these kinds of events. Mom knows what she's talking about. And I don't? Despite my degree in spatial design and years of professional experience creating environments specifically optimized for human interaction, the irony was almost painful. Richard, I literally get paid substantial consultancy fees to design spaces for maximum functionality. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. This isn't about your professional credentials. It's about family dynamics. My parents need to feel useful, especially my mother. Can't you just let her have this? The request was familiar, another instance where my legitimate concerns were positioned as selfishness, where accommodating the Richards family's needs required subordinating my own. Your mother is redecorating my house against my wishes, after. I've been displaced from my bedroom and relegated to sleeping on a couch during the most important professional week of my year, I summarized. And your concern is her feelings. Our house, Richard corrected automatically. And yes, family harmony is important to me. I thought it was to you too. The phrase struck me with sudden clarity. Our house. We had been married 3 years, during which time Richard had contributed exactly $0 to the mortgage, property taxes, or major maintenance. Yet he consistently referred to the property as ours, not in the generous marital partnership sense, but in a way that erased my primary ownership and financial responsibility. Richard, I asked carefully, how much was the property tax bill last quarter? He blinked, caught off guard by the seemingly unrelated question. What? The property tax. For our house. What was the amount? I don't. You handle the household finances, he said dismissively. What does this have to do with the dinner party? What about the mortgage payment, insurance premium, the contractor fee for the roof repair last spring? I continued, each question highlighting a financial responsibility he had happily delegated, while maintaining the fiction of equal ownership. Richard's expression darkened. I've been rebuilding my business, as you well know. We agreed that you would handle those expenses temporarily until I'm back on my feet. We did, I acknowledged. 3 years ago. and I've honored that agreement without complaint. But that arrangement doesn't transform my property into yours, nor does it give your family authority over my home design decisions. So that's what this is about? Money? His voice took on a wounded tone. I thought we were partners, Sophia. For better or worse, remember? The emotional pivot was deftly executed, transforming my request for basic respect into a mercenary fixation on finances, positioning himself as the wounded romantic while I became the coldly practical accountant. It was manipulation so practiced, I almost missed it. This isn't about money, I clarified. It's about respect. Respect for my space, my expertise, and my needs. None of which seems to be a priority for you or your family right now. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted our conversation. Aunt Meredith poked her head in, her expression apologetic. Sorry to intrude. Eleanor sent me to ask about table linens. She can't find the proper ones. Richard sighed, the conversation clearly over in his mind. We'll continue this later, he told me, before turning to Meredith. Mom probably means the cream damask set. Sophia keeps them in the cedar chest in the upstairs hallway. As he left with Meredith, I remained in the kitchen, a strange calm settling over me. Richard had no idea where I kept the linens. He had never once put them away or taken them out. Yet he had answered with complete authority, directing others through my home as if he possessed intimate knowledge of its organization. The pattern was suddenly painfully clear. Richard didn't just live in my house. He performed ownership of it, speaking authoritatively about things he knew nothing about, making decisions about spaces he didn't maintain, claiming collaborative ownership of responsibilities that fell entirely to me. I spent the remainder of the morning in my office, ostensibly working on the Henderson presentation, but actually researching something entirely different. By the time Richard knocked on my door to announce his brother's arrival, I had made several important calls and compiled a folder of essential documents. Daniel Morgan was Richard's younger brother by 3 years, more relaxed than Richard and lacking the desperate need for status that drove so much of my husband's behavior. I had always found him easier to talk to than the rest of the family, though our interactions were limited to holiday gatherings and occasional family events. Sophia? Daniel greeted me with a genuine smile as I emerged from my office. The hard-working architect emerges from her creative cave. How's the big project? Coming along? Challenging but exciting, I replied, surprised by his recollection of my work. How's the teaching position? Daniel had recently accepted an associate professorship in economics at a small liberal arts college, a career move that Eleanor regularly lamented as wasting his potential, despite Daniel's obvious satisfaction with the role. Loving it, he confirmed, though Mom keeps sending me corporate job listings as alternatives. His air quotes and eye roll conveyed his feelings about these helpful suggestions. Daniel doesn't share the family ambition, Richard commented, his tone light but carrying an unmistakable judgment. He's content with academia rather than making his mark in the real world. The real world of perpetually imminent investment? Opportunities? Daniel shot back good-naturedly. How many almost deals is this one, Richie? 5th this year? I suppressed a smile at Daniel's directness. Richard's face tightened momentarily before he forced a laugh. Mock all you want, but Tom Edwards is the real deal. Tonight's dinner will finalize what I've been working toward for months. Speaking of which, Eleanor called from the dining room, Sophia, we need your input on the dinner service. The everyday plates won't do for an event of this caliber. I excused myself to address the latest redecorating crisis, leaving the brothers to their familiar dynamic of competitive banter. In the dining room, I found Eleanor examining my dishware with evident disapproval. Don't you have proper china? She asked. Something with a gold rim, perhaps. I have the stoneware set you're holding, which is handcrafted by a renowned ceramicist, I explained. indicating the simple but elegant plates that had cost more than most commercial fine china. They're actually featured in Design Quarterly last year. Eleanor remained unimpressed. Well, they look rather plain for such an important occasion. Perhaps we could use our hotel points to purchase a suitable set before this evening. There's a department store nearby, isn't there? The suggestion that I should purchase new dishes to impress Richard's business contact for a dinner party I never wanted, in my own home where I was currently sleeping on the couch, pushed me past my tolerance threshold. The current dinnerware stays, I stated firmly. If you find it unsuitable, you're welcome to use disposable plates, but I will not be purchasing new dishes for this event. Eleanor's eyebrows rose at my uncharacteristic assertiveness. Well, someone woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning. The deliberate reference to my displacement was meant to remind me of my subsidiary position in the current household hierarchy. But instead of inducing shame, it crystallized my resolve. Yes, I did, I agreed calmly. Which is part of why I'll be sleeping in my own bed tonight. But where will Richard's father and I sleep? Eleanor asked, genuinely confused by this departure from the established arrangement. The guest room is available, I replied. The same one where Daniel will be staying. You and Walter can take that space, and Richard can join me in our bedroom. Or he's welcome to take the sofa bed. Himself, if he prefers. Eleanor's face flushed with indignation. That's completely inappropriate. Walter needs proper back support, which only your mattress provides. Richard explained this to you. He did, I acknowledged. But my need for adequate rest before my professional presentation takes precedence in my home. I've been accommodating until now, but that accommodation ends tonight. Eleanor stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. In a way, the language of boundaries was entirely new in my interactions with Richard's family. I'll need to discuss this with Richard, she finally said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. Please do, I replied, maintaining my calm demeanor. In the meantime, the stoneware stays, the dining table returns to its original position, and I'll be reclaiming my bedroom this evening. As Eleanor stormed off to find Richard, I began methodically returning the dining room to its original configuration, each deliberate action a small reclamation of my authority within my own space. By the time Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression thunderous, I had already restored much of what his mother had rearranged. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Mom is upset." "I'm preparing for a successful dinner party in a properly designed space," I replied evenly. "And yes, I imagine she is upset. People often are when they encounter boundaries for the first time." Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice to avoid being overheard. "Sophia, you're embarrassing me in front of my family. After everything I've done for you." "What exactly have you done for me, Richard?" I interrupted, the question genuine rather than rhetorical. "Please, enumerate the sacrifices you've made for my benefit lately." His momentary silence was answer enough. Richard's silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of a question he had never expected to answer. For years, our relationship had operated on the premise that his charm and social connections constituted equal contribution to our partnership, a premise I had accepted without examination until now. "I've supported your career," he finally said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I've attended your firm's events, networked with your clients, created connections that have benefited you professionally. You've attended catered events where you enjoyed complimentary food and drinks while occasionally mentioning my work to people who might be useful to your own networking," I corrected gently. "When was the last time you made a genuine sacrifice for my professional advancement?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not fair. I've been rebuilding after a significant setback. You knew that when we married." "I did," I acknowledged. "And I've supported that rebuilding with patience, financial stability, and emotional encouragement for 3 years. What I didn't agree to was surrendering my authority in my own home or subordinating my professional obligations to your family's comfort. Our home, he corrected automatically. Why do you keep saying my home like I'm some kind of tenant? The question presented the perfect opening for what needed to be addressed. I gestured toward my office. Let's continue this conversation privately. Once inside, I closed the door and retrieved the folder I had prepared earlier. Richard watched, with wary confusion as I extracted several documents and laid them on my desk. This is the deed to the property, I explained, pointing to the first document where my name appeared as the sole owner. Purchased by me 2 years before we met, using my inheritance and savings. This is the mortgage statement, showing that all payments come from my personal account. And this is our prenuptial agreement, which stipulates that property owned prior to marriage remains separate unless explicitly transferred to joint ownership. Richard stared at the documents, his expression moving from confusion to defensive anger. Are you seriously pulling out legal documents in the middle of a family disagreement? What's next? Divorce papers? I'm establishing clarity, I replied calmly. You consistently refer to this house as ours, in a way that erases my primary ownership and financial responsibility. That creates confusion about decision-making authority, as evidenced by your family's behavior since arriving. This is absurd, Richard scoffed. We're married. What's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. That's how marriage works. That's one model of marriage, I agreed. Though it's interesting how that principle seems to apply primarily to my assets rather than to shared responsibility. When was the last time you cleaned the gutters, scheduled a maintenance appointment, or even knew when the property taxes were due? Richard ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I've been focused on rebuilding my business. We agreed that you would handle the household responsibilities temporarily. We did, I acknowledged. But handling responsibilities doesn't forfeit my right to make decisions about spaces I maintain and pay for. I've been sleeping on a couch in my own home, Richard. A home where I pay the mortgage, the utilities, the insurance, and the maintenance costs. Do you understand how fundamentally disrespectful that arrangement is? Something in my calm delivery seemed to finally penetrate Richard's defensive posture. He sank into the chair across from my desk, his expression troubled. You're making it sound like I'm taking advantage of you, he said quietly. I'm highlighting a pattern that has become problematic, I clarified. One where my ownership is treated as theoretical, while yours is treated as practical. Where my expertise is dismissed while your family's preferences are prioritized. Where my professional obligations are considered flexible while your potential business opportunities are treated as sacrosanct. Richard was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between the documents on my desk and my face. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. What are you saying, Sophia? That this isn't really my home? The vulnerability in his question caught me off guard. Despite my frustration, I had no desire to wound him unnecessarily. I'm saying that home ownership comes with both privileges and responsibilities, I explained. You enjoy the privileges while delegating the responsibilities. That creates an imbalance that becomes apparent in situations like this weekend, where your family's comfort was prioritized over my basic needs without any consideration of who actually maintains this household. Richard's posture stiffened again. So this is about money, about the fact that my business setback has left me temporarily unable to contribute financially. No, I said firmly. This is about respect, about acknowledging that my name on the deed, my money paying the bills, and my labor maintaining the property gives me primary authority over how this space is used, an authority you and your family have consistently undermined since their arrival. Richard stood suddenly, pacing the small office. What do you want from me, Sophia? An apology for trying to make my family comfortable? For trying to rebuild my career with the Edwards dinner? What? I want you to recognize the actual dynamics of our living arrangement instead of maintaining The fiction that we're equal contributors to this household, I said. I want you to stop offering my home, my labor, and my resources to others without my consent. And yes, I want you to apologize for displacing me from my bedroom during the most important professional week of my year. Before Richard could respond, a knock at the office door interrupted us. Daniel poked his head in, his expression apologetic. Sorry to interrupt what sounds like an important conversation, but Mom's about to have a meltdown over the sleeping arrangements. She's threatening to call a hotel. Richard sighed heavily. Tell her I'll be right there. After Daniel left, Richard turned back to me, his expression a complex mixture of resentment and realization. We're not finished with this discussion. No, I agreed. We're just beginning it, but the immediate issue needs resolution. I will be sleeping in my bedroom tonight, Richard. Your parents are welcome to the guest room, or you can offer them our room while you take the sofa bed. He stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for some sign of flexibility. Finding none, he nodded curtly and left to deal with his mother. Alone in my office, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. The confrontation I had avoided for 3 years had finally begun, and while the outcome remained uncertain, the simple act of articulating boundaries had already shifted something fundamental in our relationship dynamic. I returned to the Henderson presentation, working steadily through the afternoon as the house bustled with dinner party preparations. Eleanor had apparently opted for the guest room rather than a hotel, though her chilly demeanor whenever we crossed paths made her displeasure evident. Richard remained distant, coordinating with caterers and arranging the dining room in accordance with my original design, a small but significant acknowledgement of my authority. By 6 o'clock, the house had been transformed for the evening's event. Despite my reservations about the timing, I had to admit that Eleanor had executed a beautiful dinner setting. My stoneware, which she had initially dismissed as inadequate, gleamed against the cream tablecloth, complemented by simple flower arrangements and elegant glassware. I changed into a charcoal gray sheath dress, professional enough for a business dinner but elegant enough for hosting, and emerged from the downstairs bathroom where my clothes were still relegated. In the kitchen, I found Richard adjusting, his tie in the reflection of the microwave door. You look nice, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Thank you, I replied, maintaining the same professional distance. So do you. An awkward silence fell between us, the remnants of our unfinished conversation creating an invisible barrier. After a moment, Richard cleared his throat. About earlier. The doorbell interrupted whatever he had been about to say. The first guests had arrived. We'll continue later, I told him, moving toward the front door. For now, let's focus on making your dinner a success. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of introductions, small talk, and careful navigation of social dynamics. Tom Edwards and his wife proved to be genuinely pleasant people. He was interested in sustainable investment opportunities. She was a former urban planner with thoughtful questions about my architectural work. The other potential investors were similarly engaging, creating a dinner atmosphere that was surprisingly enjoyable despite the underlying tensions. Eleanor had appointed herself unofficial hostess, introducing me as Richard's wife without reference to my professional identity until I gently corrected her. Walter dominated several conversations with lengthy stories about his golf achievements. Aunt Meredith and Uncle Paul maintained a tactful middle ground, occasionally sending me sympathetic glances when Eleanor was particularly overbearing. The most unexpected development was Daniel's apparent understanding of my situation. Throughout the evening, he subtly reinforced my position, referring to Sophia's beautiful home, complimenting specific design elements he knew I had created, mentioning my upcoming Henderson presentation whenever Eleanor tried to diminish my work. As the meal progressed, Tom Edwards turned to me during a lull in conversation. Richard mentioned you're working on the Henderson development. Fascinating project. Adaptive reuse with sustainability principles, isn't it? Yes, I confirmed, pleased by his knowledge. We're preserving the industrial character while transforming the space into a mixed-use community with minimal environmental impact. Sophia's being modest, Daniel interjected. Her firm beat out international competitors for that commission. The design is revolutionary. I saw the preliminary renderings when I arrived today. Eleanor smiled tightly. Sophia's little buildings are quite charming, though, of course, her primary focus is supporting Richard's career renaissance. The characterization was so blatantly false that several guests shifted uncomfortably. Tom Edwards glanced between Eleanor and me with evident confusion. Actually, I corrected gently, my architectural practice is my primary professional focus. Richard has been tremendously supportive of my career while he rebuilds his own business ventures. The subtle recalibration, transforming Eleanor's narrative of my subsidiary role into one of mutual support, preserved Richard's dignity while asserting my professional identity. Richard caught my eye from across the table, his expression a mixture of surprise and what might have been gratitude. The remainder of the dinner proceeded smoothly, with conversation flowing between business topics and more personal exchanges. By the time dessert was served, it was clear that Tom Edwards was genuinely interested in Richard's investment proposal. Though how much of that interest was due to Richard's pitch versus the impressive setting and meal remained unclear. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Tom pulled Richard aside for what appeared to be a private conversation. From their body language and Richard's growing smile, the discussion seemed positive. When the last guests had left, Richard closed the front door and turned to face his family and me, his expression triumphant. "He's in," Richard announced. "Tom wants to move forward with the preliminary investment. We're meeting his financial team next week to structure the deal." Walter clapped his son on the back while Eleanor beamed with maternal pride. "I knew this dinner would make the difference," she declared. "Proper hosting always seals these arrangements." "Congratulations, Richard," I said sincerely. Despite our ongoing conflict, I genuinely wanted him to succeed, both for his own well-being and for the health of our marriage. "This calls for celebration," Walter announced, retrieving a bottle of expensive scotch from his luggage, apparently brought specifically for this contingency. As the family gathered in the living room for a celebratory drink, I excused myself to begin clearing the dining room. In the kitchen, I had just begun loading the dishwasher when Richard appeared in the doorway. "Leave that for now," he said. "Come join the celebration. This success belongs to all of us." The invitation seemed genuine, but something in his phrasing caught my attention. "All of us?" "Well, yes," Richard replied. "The dinner was a team effort. Mom's planning, your home, everyone contributing to make the right impression." "My home," I repeated quietly, noting his unconscious correction of the ownership he had so vehemently insisted was shared just hours earlier. Richard's expression faltered as he realized his slip. "Sophia, it's fine," I assured him. "I'm genuinely happy for your success, Richard. But I'm also exhausted, and tomorrow's Henderson presentation requires my full attention. I'll leave you and your family to celebrate while I get some much-needed rest in my bedroom." For a moment, Richard looked as though he might argue. Then, surprisingly, he simply nodded. "We'll keep it down. And thank you for tonight. For how you handled things with Tom. You could have undermined me after our argument, but you didn't." The acknowledgement, small as it was, represented the first genuine recognition of my support that Richard had offered in months. I accepted it with a nod before heading upstairs to reclaim my bedroom, leaving Richard to navigate the changed dynamics with his family. As I prepared for bed in the master bathroom, my toiletries returned to their proper places, I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration from downstairs. Eleanor's voice rose occasionally above the others, likely holding court with stories of Richard's childhood achievements or dispensing wisdom about his future success. For the first time in days, I felt a genuine sense of peace as I slipped between the sheets of my own bed. The confrontation with Richard had been difficult but necessary, the beginning of a recalibration that our marriage desperately needed. Whether that recalibration would strengthen our relationship or reveal insurmountable incompatibilities remained to be seen. But the first step had been taken. With the comfort of my proper mattress supporting my back and the quiet satisfaction of having finally established essential boundaries, I drifted into the deepest sleep I'd had in days, mentally preparing for both the Henderson presentation and the continued conversation that awaited me when Richard eventually came upstairs. I awakened to sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows, a welcome change from the dimly lit living room couch where I'd spent the previous nights. The digital clock on my nightstand read 6:15 a.m., giving me a full hour before I needed to begin preparing for my Henderson presentation. The house remained quiet, suggesting Richard and his family were still asleep. As I savored the comfort of my proper bed, I noticed something unusual. Richard's side remained undisturbed. The pillow was still perfectly positioned, the covers untouched. He hadn't joined me last night. Curious about his whereabouts, I slipped on my robe and descended quietly to the main floor. In the living room, I found Richard asleep on the pull-out couch, one arm thrown over his face to block the morning light. The sight was oddly poignant, my husband experiencing firsthand the discomfort he had so casually assigned to me. I moved to the kitchen and began brewing coffee, trying to process my conflicted emotions. On one hand, Richard's choice to take the couch rather than join me in our bedroom suggested he was honoring my reclamation of that space. On the other, his absence indicated a continuing rift between us, one that needed addressing before it widened further. As the coffee percolated, I heard movement from the guest room. Moments later, Daniel appeared, looking surprisingly alert for the early hour. "Morning," he greeted me quietly. "Coffee smells amazing." I poured him a cup, grateful for his understated presence. Unlike the rest of Richard's family, Daniel seemed to respect the boundaries of my home without requiring explicit direction. "Richard spent the night on the couch," I observed, keeping my voice low. Daniel nodded. "Mom was quite vocal about Walter needing the guest bed for his back. When Richard mentioned joining you upstairs, she suggested it might be disruptive to your rest, given your important presentation today." The irony was almost painful. After insisting I sleep on the uncomfortable sofa bed despite my professional obligations, Eleanor had suddenly developed concern for my rest, but only when it meant Richard would experience the discomfort instead. "That was considerate of her," I managed, not quite keeping the dryness from my tone. Daniel's lips twitched in a suppressed smile. "Mom operates on her own unique logic, though I suspect Richard's choice was less about her suggestions and more about giving you space after yesterday's discussion." I glanced at him sharply. "You overheard?" "Only fragments," Daniel assured me. "Enough to understand that long overdue boundaries were being established. For what it's worth, I think it's healthy. Richard has always had a selective perception of reality when it comes to contributions and credit. The observation was astute and surprisingly forthright. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. Growing up with Richard required diplomacy," Daniel replied with a slight shrug. "He's 6 years older, supposedly wiser, and definitely louder about his accomplishments, real or anticipated." This glimpse into their childhood dynamic offered context I had previously lacked. "Your parents encouraged that perception?" "Actively cultivated it," Daniel confirmed. "Richard was the golden child, destined for spectacular success. I was the backup plan, the steady, reliable one who would pursue a safe career. Mom still introduces me as our professor, with the same tone she might say, our convicted felon." I laughed despite myself, recognizing Eleanor's dismissive categorization of careers she deemed insufficient. Yet you seem remarkably well adjusted. Therapy helps, Daniel said with disarming frankness. Plus the distance of living 3 states away. Limited exposure is the key to maintaining family relationships sometimes. The simple acknowledgement that family relationships might require professional help and strategic limitation rather than unconditional accommodation was refreshing. It contrasted sharply with Richard's insistence that family harmony required my complete surrender to his parents' preferences. I should warn you, Daniel added, glancing toward the hallway. Mom's planning a full family breakfast before your presentation. She mentioned something about everyone gathering to send you off properly. The prospect of navigating Eleanor's passive-aggressive support while preparing mentally for my presentation was distinctly unappealing. That's not necessary. I usually have a light breakfast before important meetings. Helps maintain mental clarity. I suspected as much, Daniel said, which is why I set my alarm early. If you want to escape before the family descends, now's your window. I'll cover for you. The offer of alliance was unexpected, but welcome. You'd do that? Consider it. Repayment for enduring our family circus with such grace, he replied. Plus, having witnessed your work ethic these past days, I know how important this presentation is. You deserve the space to prepare properly. His simple recognition of my professional commitment, something Richard and his parents had consistently minimized, was deeply validating. Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate that more than you know. I returned to my bedroom to dress, selecting the charcoal gray suit I reserved for major presentations. As I applied minimal makeup and arranged my hair into a sleek chignon, I heard the household beginning to stir. Eleanor's voice directing someone in the kitchen, Walter's heavy footsteps in the hallway, the shower running in the guest bathroom. After gathering my portfolio and presentation materials, I descended the stairs to find Daniel strategically positioned at the front door, keys in hand. Mom's organizing breakfast preparations, he whispered. I told her you were in the shower. My car's unlocked. Black Audi at the curb. I'll text Richard that you needed to leave early for final presentation prep. Won't you get interrogated? For helping me escape? I asked, genuinely concerned about putting him in Eleanor's crosshairs. Daniel grinned. I'm the disappointing second son, remember? Mom's expectations of me are so low that minor betrayals barely register. Now go shine. At that presentation. With a grateful nod, I slipped out the front door and into Daniel's car. The simple act of prioritizing my professional obligations without apology or negotiation felt like a revelation. For too long, I had approached my career as something that required permission and accommodation rather than something that deserved respect and support. The architecture firm was quiet when I arrived, giving me 2 uninterrupted hours to review my presentation materials and center myself mentally. By the time my colleagues began arriving, I felt prepared and focused in a way that would have been impossible had I remained at home navigating Eleanor's supportive breakfast. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Hope your presentation goes well. Sorry about the couch situation. We should talk when you get home. The message was concise, but contained something I hadn't expected, an acknowledgement of the couch situation coupled with an apology. It suggested that perhaps experiencing the discomfort firsthand had provided perspective Richard had previously lacked. I replied simply, "Thank you." "Yes, we should talk. We'll be home around 6. The Henderson presentation itself exceeded my expectations. The clients responded enthusiastically to my proposed designs, particularly the integration of historical industrial elements with sustainable new construction. When the senior partner invited me to lead the implementation phase, a significant promotion that would come with substantial additional compensation, I accepted with confidence rather than the reflexive hesitation that had characterized my previous career decisions. Your vision for this project is exactly what Henderson Development has been seeking, Mr. Henderson himself told me afterward. The way you've balanced respect for the site's history with forward-thinking sustainability principles is remarkable. We're excited to see this realized under your direction. The validation of my professional expertise, from clients who had no personal investment in either inflating or diminishing my abilities, was profoundly affirming. For years, Richard and his family had subtly undermined my confidence by treating my architecture career as a charming hobby rather than a significant profession. Mr. Henderson's unqualified endorsement confirmed what I had always known, but sometimes doubted. I was exceptionally good at what I did. As I drove home that evening, I contemplated how to approach the conversation awaiting me. The confrontation with Richard had begun, but remained unresolved. His text suggested an openness to discussion, but whether that would translate to meaningful change remained uncertain. To my surprise, I found the house unexpectedly quiet upon my return. A note on the kitchen counter explained the absence. Mom, Dad, Meredith, and Paul have gone to dinner with Richard's potential investors. Daniel took a campus tour at the local university. Everyone should be back around 9. R. The temporary reprieve. From the family dynamics allowed me to decompress from the day's intensity. I changed into more comfortable clothes, poured a glass of wine, and settled at my desk to review the notes from the Henderson meeting. I was so absorbed in work that I barely registered the front door opening an hour later. When I looked up, Richard stood in my office doorway, his expression uncertain. "You're back early," I observed, setting aside my notes. "We finished sooner than expected," he replied. "How was the presentation?" "Successful," I said, unable to suppress a smile. "They've approved the design concept and asked me to lead the implementation phase. It's a significant promotion." "Sophia, that's wonderful." Richard's enthusiasm seemed genuine. "Congratulations." "You've worked incredibly hard for this." "Thank you." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "We should talk, as you mentioned in your text." Richard nodded, taking the offered seat. For a moment, he seemed uncharacteristically hesitant, fidgeting with his wedding band in a nervous gesture I rarely observed in him. "I spent last night on the pull-out couch," he finally said. "I noticed." It was. He paused, searching for the right word. Illuminating. I didn't sleep well. My back hurts. I woke up with a crick in my neck that still hasn't gone away. He met my gaze directly. "And you were expected to sleep there all week while preparing for a career-defining presentation." The acknowledgement was unexpected in its directness. "Yes." "I didn't think about it that way when I moved your things," Richard admitted. "I was focused on accommodating my parents, making them comfortable. I didn't consider what that accommodation cost you, or that it wasn't your decision to make in a house you don't financially maintain," I added quietly. Richard winced slightly but nodded. "The documents you showed me yesterday. I knew intellectually that you owned the house before we married, but I've been operating as though my name was on the deed alongside yours. As though my contribution of living here somehow equaled your contribution of paying for it. And maintaining it," I reminded him, "and cleaning it, and handling all the administrative tasks associated with home ownership." "Yes." Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine discomfort. "After you left this morning, Daniel said something that stuck with me. He asked what would happen if our situations were reversed, if you had moved into my home, then invited your family to stay without consulting me, and relegated me to sleeping on a couch during my most important professional week." The thought experiment was precisely what Richard had needed, a direct inversion that made the power imbalance impossible to ignore. "What was your answer?" "That I would have been furious," Richard admitted. "That I would have felt disrespected and undermined in my own home. That I would have questioned whether my partner actually valued me and my work." He looked up, meeting my gaze directly. "In other words, exactly how you must have felt these past days." The acknowledgement was so precisely what I had needed to hear that for a moment I couldn't respond. After 3 years of subtle dismissals and casual appropriation, Richard was finally seeing our dynamic with clarity. "Yes," I said simply. "That's exactly how I felt." Richard leaned forward, his expression sincere. "I'm sorry, Sophia. Genuinely sorry. Not just for the sleeping arrangements, but for the pattern of behavior that made those arrangements seem acceptable to me. For treating your house as mine without the corresponding responsibilities. For allowing my family to disregard your authority in your own space." The apology addressed the core issues rather than merely the symptoms, a significant departure from Richard's usual approach of superficial contrition followed by continued behavior. Still, I remained cautious. "Thank you for recognizing that," I said carefully. "But acknowledgement is only the first step. Our relationship has developed serious imbalances that won't be resolved with a single conversation." "I know," Richard agreed, "which is why I've been thinking about concrete changes." He extracted a folded paper from his pocket and placed it on the desk between us. "This is a first attempt at rebalancing our partnership. I'd like your input on whether it addresses your concerns." I unfolded the paper to find a list written in Richard's precise handwriting. 1. Financial contribution. Open joint account for household expenses with monthly transfers from my business account proportional to income. 2. Home maintenance. Take responsibility for specific maintenance tasks, lawn care, minor repairs, seasonal maintenance, to reduce Sophia's workload. 3. Family boundaries. No overnight guests without mutual agreement. My family stays in hotels for future visits unless explicitly invited by Sophia. 4. Professional respect. Actively support Sophia's career through practical assistance, not just rhetorical endorsement. 5. Decision-making. Acknowledge Sophia's primary authority over home design and use, with decisions affecting shared spaces made collaboratively. The list represented a thoughtful analysis of our core issues with specific, actionable solutions rather than vague promises. Most importantly, it acknowledged the fundamental power imbalance that had developed in our relationship without defensive justification. "This is comprehensive," I said, genuinely impressed by the effort it represented. "It's a starting point," Richard replied. "Daniel helped me think through some of it, actually. He has a clearer perspective on family dynamics than I realized." The mention of Daniel's involvement explained the list's insightful nature. "You discussed our marriage with your brother?" "In general terms," Richard clarified. He noticed the imbalance immediately and called me out on it rather bluntly. Said he was impressed you hadn't kicked me and my entitled attitude to the curb years ago. His words, not mine. I couldn't help smiling at Daniel's characterization. "Your brother is surprisingly perceptive." "And alarmingly direct," Richard agreed with a rueful smile. "But he was right. I've been taking your support, emotional, financial, professional, for granted while offering little in return. That's not partnership, it's parasitism." The stark self-assessment suggested a level of introspection I hadn't previously observed in Richard. What prompted this revelation, besides one uncomfortable night on the couch? Richard considered the question carefully. "Seeing you stand your ground? Yesterday was part of it. You've always been accommodating, perhaps too accommodating, which made it easy for me to avoid examining my behavior, but there was something else, something more fundamental." "What was that?" "Watching you with the Henderson clients last night," Richard said. "How they respected your expertise without question. How confidently you presented your vision. How genuinely they valued your contribution." He paused, seeming to struggle with the admission. "It made me realize I've been diminishing your professional accomplishments partly because acknowledging their significance highlights the gap between your success and my lack thereof." The honesty of the admission was both painful and necessary. For years, I had sensed this dynamic without being able to articulate it. Richard's need to minimize my achievements to maintain his self-perception as the more successful partner. Professional success isn't a competition between spouses, I said gently. Your setbacks don't diminish your worth, and my achievements don't threaten your value, unless we frame our relationship as a zero-sum game. I know that intellectually, Richard acknowledged. But emotionally, I've been compensating for my financial dependence by asserting control in other areas, like this house, like our social presentations to others, like family dynamics. The insight was remarkably self-aware, suggesting that the confrontation had prompted genuine reflection rather than mere defensive accommodation. Where does this leave us? I asked. This level of imbalance doesn't develop overnight, and it won't be resolved with a single conversation or list of commitments. Richard nodded. I know. Which is why I'd like to suggest we consider couples counseling, not because we're failing, but because we need neutral guidance to restructure patterns that have become habitual. The suggestion caught me completely off guard. Richard had always dismissed therapy as unnecessary emotional indulgence whenever I had hinted at it previously. That he would now propose it unprompted indicated a significant shift in perspective. I think that's an excellent idea, I said cautiously. But I'm curious, what changed your mind about counseling? Richard's smile was self-deprecating. Daniel may have mentioned how transformative therapy was for helping him navigate our family dynamics, and it occurred to me that if my supposedly less ambitious brother has the courage to do the emotional work I've been avoiding, perhaps I should reconsider my resistance. The humility in his response was genuine and disarming. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt a glimmer of the connection that had initially drawn us together. Richard's capacity for growth when motivated, his underlying decency beneath the layers of status-seeking and insecurity. I'd like to try, I said finally. Not because I've given up on us, but because I believe we're worth the effort of rebuilding properly. Relief washed over Richard's features. Thank you for being willing to work on this instead of simply showing me the door after my behavior this week. As we continued talking, outlining next steps and specific commitments, I heard vehicles arriving outside, the rest of the family returning from dinner. Richard glanced toward the window, then back at me with newfound determination. I'll handle them, he said, standing. You've had a long day, and you deserve to celebrate your presentation success without navigating family dynamics. Why don't you enjoy some quiet time while I manage the evening logistics? The offer to run interference with his family, a small but significant act of practical support, felt like the first tangible evidence of Richard's commitment to change. As he left to greet his returning family, I remained in my office, reflecting on the unexpected developments of the day. The boundary setting that had begun as a desperate act of self-preservation had catalyzed what appeared to be genuine introspection and commitment to change from Richard. Whether this revelation would translate to sustained transformation remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, I felt cautiously optimistic about our partnership's potential for rebalancing. Most importantly, I had reclaimed not just my physical space in our home, but my agency within our relationship, the authority to define appropriate boundaries and expect their respect. That reclamation, regardless of the ultimate outcome with Richard, represented a personal breakthrough that would shape all my relationships moving forward. Morning sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows as I awakened, feeling more rested than I had in days. Richard lay asleep beside me, his first night back in our shared bed since his family's arrival. His return wasn't just a practical adjustment, but a symbolic one, representing his commitment to the relationship reset we had begun discussing. I slipped quietly from bed, careful not to disturb him, and padded to the kitchen to start coffee. The house was unusually peaceful, lacking the bustling morning activity that had characterized the past several days. A note on the refrigerator explained why. Taking parents sightseeing today, back for dinner. D. Daniel had once again provided an unexpected reprieve, giving Richard and me space to continue our conversation without family interference. The thoughtfulness of the gesture confirmed my growing appreciation for my brother-in-law's perceptiveness and consideration. As I savored my first sip of coffee, my phone chimed with an email notification from the Henderson project team. The message included praise for yesterday's presentation and a detailed timeline for the implementation phase. Seeing my name listed as project lead, with the corresponding salary adjustment clearly indicated, brought a surge of professional satisfaction. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair tousled from sleep but his eyes alert. "Good morning. Is there enough coffee for a second cup?" "Always," I replied, gesturing toward the pot. "Your family's out with Daniel today." He mentioned they've been wanting to see the art museum. Richard filled a mug and leaned against the counter. "Sophia, about yesterday's conversation. I meant what I said about making changes. But I've been thinking about something specific that needs addressing immediately." His serious tone caught my attention. "What's that?" "The dinner party for Tom Edwards and his team," Richard said. "I realized I never properly thanked you for it. The investment opportunity is moving forward because you graciously allowed your home to be used for entertaining, despite your presentation deadline, and are ongoing." Disagreements. The acknowledgement was specific and thoughtful, recognizing not just the outcome, but the sacrifice it had required from me. "I appreciate that, Richard. Though, to be fair, I didn't have much choice in the matter." "You did, though," Richard countered. "You could have refused outright, or sabotaged the evening in 100 subtle ways. Instead, you were gracious with my potential investors and even helped redirect the conversation when Mom tried to minimize your work." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. That generosity should be acknowledged, not taken for granted. The simple recognition of my contribution, without expectation or manipulation, felt refreshingly genuine. "Thank you for seeing that." "There's more," Richard continued. "I spoke with Tom Edwards this morning. He was quite impressed by you, particularly your insights about adaptive reuse principles. It turns out his investment group has been looking for architectural expertise for some upcoming projects. He asked specifically if you might be interested in consulting." I set down my coffee cup, surprised by this unexpected development. "Consulting on what exactly?" "They're diversifying into sustainable commercial development, renovating older buildings with green technology while preserving architectural integrity. Apparently, your comments about the Henderson project aligned perfectly with their vision." Richard smiled slightly. "He actually said meeting you was more valuable than meeting me, though he was tactful about it." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Richard's carefully orchestrated dinner party, designed to showcase his business acumen, had unexpectedly created a professional opportunity for me instead. "That's unexpected," I managed, processing the implications. "It's also appropriate," Richard acknowledged. "Your expertise is genuine and substantive. Mine remains more theoretical at this point." He hesitated before adding, "In the past, I might have resented this development or tried to insert myself as an intermediary to maintain some claim on the connection. Today, I simply want to pass along the opportunity you earned through your own merit." The distinction he drew between past and present behavior demonstrated a self-awareness that felt new. Richard had always been quick to claim connections and leverage relationships for his benefit. Stepping back to allow me direct professional access without attaching himself to the transaction represented genuine growth. "I appreciate both the opportunity and how you're presenting it," I said carefully, "though I'll need to consider how it fits with my current commitments, especially with the Henderson implementation phase starting." "Of course," Richard agreed readily. "Your professional decisions remain entirely yours. I'm simply serving as a messenger in this case." We moved to the living room with our coffee, settling into the comfortable seating arrangement that had been disrupted by the pull-out sofa for the past few days. The physical restoration of our living space paralleled the relational recalibration we were attempting, returning elements to their proper places with new awareness of their value. "I've been thinking about my role in our household going forward," Richard said after a comfortable silence. "Specifically about practical ways to shift from theoretical partnership to actual shared responsibility." "I'm listening," I encouraged, curious about his conclusions. "First, the financial aspect," he began. "I've set up automatic transfers from my business account to our joint household account, starting with what I can manage now, but with a commitment to increase the percentage as my income grows." The concrete financial step addressed one of the most fundamental imbalances in our relationship: the disconnect between Richard's claims of equal partnership and his minimal financial contribution to our shared life. "That's meaningful," I acknowledged, "though our issues go beyond financial arrangements." "Absolutely," Richard agreed. "Which brings me to household management. I've created a shared digital calendar for home maintenance tasks, clearly dividing responsibilities between us. I've claimed the exterior maintenance, routine repairs, and administrative paperwork for things like insurance and property taxes." The systematic approach impressed me, particularly Richard's willingness to take on paperwork he had previously dismissed as unnecessary bureaucracy that didn't warrant his attention. "You mentioned property taxes," I noted, recalling our earlier conversation where he couldn't recall the amount. "Have you actually reviewed those documents?" "I spent 2 hours yesterday afternoon going through the filing cabinet while you were at your presentation," Richard admitted. "It was educational. I had no idea how much administrative work goes into maintaining this property or how meticulously you've documented everything." The admission carried genuine appreciation rather than defensiveness. "Home ownership involves significant invisible labor," I observed. "Labor that has fallen entirely to me until now. Labor I've benefited from while claiming equal ownership." "Rights," Richard acknowledged, completing the thought with new self-awareness. "That changes starting today." As Richard outlined additional specific commitments, from managing his family's expectations about future visits to creating boundaries around my professional time, I observed a fundamental shift in his approach. Rather than offering vague assurances or temporary accommodations, he was proposing structural changes with built-in accountability. "These are all excellent steps," I said when he finished. "But I'm curious about something. Yesterday you mentioned couples counseling. Yet today you're presenting a comprehensive plan you've developed independently. How do those approaches align?" Richard considered the question thoughtfully. "The plan addresses immediate imbalances that don't require professional mediation to recognize or correct. They are objectively unequal distributions of labor and authority that I can and should adjust unilaterally. The counseling is for the deeper patterns, the assumptions and expectations we've both developed that create the conditions for these imbalances to form in the first place." The distinction demonstrated a nuanced understanding that surprised me. "That's remarkably insightful, Richard." He smiled ruefully. Credit Daniel again. When I outlined my initial thoughts, he pointed out the difference between taking responsibility for my behavior versus expecting you to participate in fixing problems I created. His exact words were, "Don't ask Sophia to do the emotional labor of helping you become a better husband." I laughed despite myself, appreciating Daniel's directness. "Your brother has unexpected depths." "He does," Richard agreed, which makes me question my dismissive attitude toward his career choices. All these years. His less ambitious path seems to have given him emotional intelligence and perspective I've been sorely lacking. This willingness to reconsider long-held judgments suggested the introspection extended beyond our immediate relationship issues to Richard's broader value system, the metrics by which he measured success and worth. "Speaking of family," I said, transitioning to a topic we needed to address before his parents returned, "how do you plan to handle the remainder of their visit? Eleanor specifically seems to struggle with acknowledging my authority in this home. Richard's expression grew more serious. I've already spoken with them. Had a rather difficult conversation while you were at your presentation yesterday. I explained that my behavior had been inappropriate and disrespectful to you, particularly regarding sleeping arrangements and decision-making authority. How did they respond? I asked, imagining Eleanor's likely reaction to such a conversation. About as well as you'd expect, Richard admitted. Mom was defensive initially, insisting she was only trying to help and that family should accommodate each other's needs. Dad mostly looked uncomfortable and studied his coffee cup. And your conclusion? That their visit will end tomorrow, rather than extending through the week as originally planned, Richard stated firmly. I've booked them. Flights home and made it clear that future visits will involve hotel accommodations and advance planning with both of us. The decisive boundary setting with his family, particularly his mother, represented perhaps the most significant evidence of Richard's commitment to change. Throughout our marriage, he had consistently prioritized his parents' expectations and comfort over our relationship dynamics. How did Eleanor take that news? I asked, genuinely curious about his mother's response to such unprecedented limits. She suggested I was being manipulated, Richard said with remarkable candor. That you were turning me against my family by asserting ownership claims on our home during a temporary financial setback. The characterization was precisely what I would have expected from Eleanor, framing my reasonable boundaries as manipulation while recasting Richard's financial dependence as a minor, temporary situation, rather than a 3-year reality. And your response? I asked carefully. I corrected her understanding of several key points, Richard replied, his tone measured. First, that my temporary setback has extended for 3 years, during which time you've supported us both without complaint. Second, that your assertion of authority isn't manipulation, but rather an overdue correction to my inappropriate appropriation of your property. And third, that respecting my wife's boundaries doesn't constitute being turned against my family. It merely establishes appropriate priorities as a married adult. The detailed, articulate response suggested Richard had prepared carefully for the conversation, anticipating his mother's reactions and formulating clear counters to her manipulative framing. That couldn't have been an easy conversation, I observed. It wasn't, Richard acknowledged. Mom cried. Dad looked disappointed. Meredith and Paul excused themselves awkwardly. Only Daniel seemed unsurprised and supportive. He met my gaze directly, but necessary conversations rarely happen comfortably. Something else I'm learning belatedly? As we continued talking, exploring both practical adjustments and deeper relational patterns, I observed a fundamental shift in our dynamic. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, we were engaging as genuine equals, neither of us attempting to manage the other's perception or maintain artificial hierarchies. There's something else we should discuss, I said, as our conversation reached a natural pause. The Henderson promotion changes our financial situation significantly. The implementation phase comes with a substantial salary increase and potential performance bonuses. Richard nodded. Congratulations again. You've earned every bit of that recognition. Thank you, but I mention it because it potentially widens the income gap between us at a time when you're already feeling sensitive about financial contributions. I was careful to present this as a practical consideration rather than a criticism. How do you think that might affect the changes we're discussing? The question might have triggered defensiveness in the past. Today, Richard considered it thoughtfully. It's a fair concern, he acknowledged. There's a part of me that immediately feels diminished by the comparison, a reaction I need to examine rather than act upon. Your success is objectively good, for both of us, practically and relationally. If my ego can't accommodate that reality, that's my issue to address, not a problem for you to manage. The distinction, between his emotional response and my responsibility for it, represented one of the most significant shifts in our interaction. For years, I had adjusted my behavior to accommodate Richard's insecurities, minimizing my achievements, or presenting them in ways that centered his contribution to avoid triggering his defensiveness. "I appreciate that perspective," I said, "though I'm not suggesting your feelings aren't valid or important in our relationship." "They're valid but not determinative," Richard clarified. "I can acknowledge feeling insecure about our income. Disparity without expecting you to modify your career trajectory to protect that insecurity. The appropriate response is for me to address the underlying issue through personal growth and practical achievement, not for you to diminish yourself, to maintain my comfort." The maturity of the response was striking, not because Richard was incapable of such insight, but because he had rarely applied it to our relationship dynamics previously. As noon approached, we moved to the kitchen to prepare lunch together, a simple meal, but one we created collaboratively rather than defaulting to our usual pattern where I handled all food preparation while Richard made important calls. "I've scheduled an initial consultation with a couples therapist for next week," Richard mentioned as we ate. "3 options, actually, so we can select someone we both feel comfortable with." The proactive step demonstrated his commitment extended beyond our immediate conversation to concrete follow-through. "Thank you for taking that initiative. It's the minimum required to demonstrate seriousness," Richard replied. "Words are easy. Actions require actual effort and accountability." As we finished lunch and cleared the dishes together, another small but significant shift in our household patterns, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable evolution of the past several days. What had begun as a crisis triggered by sleeping, arrangements had catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of our entire relationship structure. "What are you thinking?" Richard asked, noticing my contemplative expression. "That crisis often creates clarity," I replied. "If your family hadn't visited, if you hadn't displaced me from my bedroom, we might have continued in our imbalanced patterns indefinitely. Sometimes disruption is necessary for growth." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "The question becomes whether the growth is sustainable once the crisis passes. It's relatively easy to make promises during moments of intense awareness. The real test comes in daily choices when the emotional urgency fades." The self-awareness inherent in his observation was perhaps the most encouraging aspect of our conversation. Richard wasn't just offering solutions to immediate problems. He was acknowledging the challenge of maintaining commitment to change over time. "That's why the structural changes matter," I observed. "The calendar for household responsibilities, the automatic financial transfers, the couple's counseling appointments, they create accountability beyond momentary good intentions." "Exactly," Richard agreed. "And why I need to explicitly invite your feedback when I inevitably backslide into old patterns. Because I will, at least sometimes. Change isn't linear." As we moved to the living room, preparing to enjoy a rare, quiet afternoon together before his family returned, my phone chimed with a calendar notification. "Henderson implementation phase, initial team meeting, scheduled for the following morning." Richard noticed the alert. "Your new leadership role officially begins tomorrow," he observed. "How are you feeling about it?" "Excited. Ready." I smiled, realizing the truth of my response. "Confident in a way I haven't felt professionally in quite some time." "As you should be," Richard said sincerely. "Your talent has never been the limiting factor in your career advancement." The implication hung unspoken between us, that perhaps the most significant limitation had been the relationship dynamics we were now actively addressing. Not through malicious intent, but through unchallenged patterns that had gradually constrained my professional assertiveness and personal authority. As we settled into comfortable conversation about the Henderson project, my upcoming leadership role, and Richard's developing investment opportunity with Tom Edwards, I recognized a qualitative difference in our interaction. We were discussing our individual professional paths with mutual support and genuine interest, without the subtle competition or defensive positioning that had characterized similar conversations in the past. When the front door opened hours later, signaling the return of Richard's family from their outing, I felt a momentary tension. Despite our productive conversation and Richard's assurances about establishing boundaries, Eleanor's presence remained a challenging dynamic to navigate. Richard squeezed my hand reassuringly before rising to greet his family. "Let me handle this," he said quietly. "You've maintained boundaries through difficult circumstances all week. It's my turn to reinforce them." As he moved to intercept, his family in the entryway, directing them toward the kitchen for refreshments rather than allowing them to immediately dominate our living space, I observed the subtle but significant shift in his demeanor. He was neither apologetic nor confrontational, simply clear and direct about the evening's arrangements and expectations. Eleanor's disappointment at their abbreviated visit was evident, but Richard remained firm without becoming combative. Walter accepted the change with resigned practicality. Daniel caught my eye across the room and offered a subtle thumbs up, acknowledging his brother's improved handling of family dynamics. The remainder of the evening unfolded with a new equilibrium, not perfect harmony, but a more balanced exchange where Eleanor's attempts to dominate were gently but consistently redirected, and my position as co-owner of the household was implicitly reinforced through 100 small acknowledgments. As we prepared for bed that night, Richard paused in the doorway of our bedroom, seeming to register anew the significance of the space. "Thank you for allowing me back," he said quietly. "This is our room," I replied. "The question was never whether you belonged here, but whether you recognized that I did too." Richard nodded, understanding the distinction. "I'm beginning to see how many spaces, physical and metaphorical, I've claimed without earning. That changes starting now." As we settled into bed together, the symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on either of us. The reclamation of my physical space within our home had catalyzed a broader reclamation of my agency within our relationship, a transformation that promised to reshape not just our marriage, but my approach to all relationships moving forward. The woman who had accepted sleeping on a couch in her own home just days earlier had found her voice, established her boundaries, and discovered that genuine partnership required both the courage to demand respect and the wisdom to recognize when it was sincerely offered. The day of Richard's family departure arrived with a palpable sense of anticipation. Eleanor had maintained a carefully orchestrated air of martyrdom throughout the previous evening, sighs just audible enough to be noticed, references to their abbreviated visit inserted into unrelated conversations, and pointed comments about families growing apart when careers take precedence. I awoke early, determined to maintain the new equilibrium we had established. Richard was already up, the sounds of his activity in the kitchen suggesting he was preparing breakfast. This simple role reversal, Richard handling morning meal preparation rather than Richard squeezed my hand reassuringly before rising to greet his family. "Let me handle this," he said quietly. "You've maintained boundaries through difficult circumstances all week. It's my turn to reinforce them." As he moved to intercept, his family in the entryway, directing them toward the kitchen for refreshments rather than allowing them to immediately dominate our living space, I observed the subtle but significant shift in his demeanor. He was neither apologetic nor confrontational, simply clear and direct about the evening's arrangements and expectations. Eleanor's disappointment at their abbreviated visit was evident, but Richard remained firm without becoming combative. Walter accepted the change with resigned practicality. Daniel caught my eye across the room and offered a subtle thumbs up, acknowledging his brother's improved handling of family dynamics. The remainder of the evening unfolded with a new equilibrium, not perfect harmony, but a more balanced exchange where Eleanor's attempts to dominate were gently but consistently redirected, and my position as co-owner of the household was implicitly reinforced through 100 small acknowledgments. As we prepared for bed that night, Richard paused in the doorway of our bedroom, seeming to register anew the significance of the space. "Thank you for allowing me back," he said quietly. "This is our room," I replied. "The question was never whether you belonged here, but whether you recognized that I did too." Richard nodded, understanding the distinction. "I'm beginning to see how many spaces, physical and metaphorical, I've claimed without earning. That changes starting now." As we settled into bed together, the symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on either of us. The reclamation of my physical space within our home had catalyzed a broader reclamation of my agency within our relationship, a transformation that promised to reshape not just our marriage, but my approach to all relationships moving forward. The woman who had accepted sleep before I could respond diplomatically, Richard intervened. "Actually, Mom, as I explained yesterday, the schedule adjustment was my decision based on several factors, including my recognition that I had imposed on Sophia's hospitality without proper consultation. Her meeting schedule is entirely coincidental." The clear correction, delivered without apology but also without confrontation, represented a significant departure from Richard's typical pattern of accommodating his mother's narrative manipulations. Eleanor appeared momentarily nonplussed, unused to having her framing challenged by her son. "Well," she recovered, "families accommodate each other. That's what being family means." "Accommodation should be mutual," Richard replied, setting a plate of fresh fruit on the table. "Something I've been learning to appreciate more fully." Daniel entered the kitchen, breaking the momentary tension. "Morning, everyone. Bags all." Packed and ready by the door. He accepted the coffee Richard offered with a nod of thanks. "What time is the car arriving?" 10 o'clock, Walter confirmed, checking his watch. "Just over an hour from now." As the family settled into breakfast, I observed the subtle differences in their interaction patterns. Richard maintained a warm but definite boundary, gently redirecting his mother's attempts to dominate conversation or critique our household arrangements. Daniel occasionally caught my eye with a slight smile, acknowledging these shifts. Walter seemed largely content to follow the new relational choreography, without comment. When my phone chimed with a reminder of my upcoming meeting, Richard immediately spoke up. "You should go prepare for your meeting. I'll handle things here and see everyone off." "Are you sure?" I asked, though the offer was precisely what I needed. "Absolutely." His smile conveyed understanding of both the practical and symbolic importance of this division of responsibilities. "Your team is waiting. This is my department today." Eleanor watched this exchange with barely concealed disapproval. "Hardly seems hospitable to abandon departing guests, but I suppose professional ambition operates on its own schedule." "Mom," Richard's voice carried a gentle but unmistakable warning tone, "Sophia has been an exceptionally gracious host despite challenging circumstances. Her professional commitments deserve our respect." The direct defense, delivered without anger but with clear expectations, silenced Eleanor more effectively than any emotional response could have. She blinked, unused to encountering firm boundaries from her son. "Of course," she conceded with forced graciousness. "Sophia's work is important. We understand." I excused myself with appropriate farewells to everyone, promising to connect with Daniel before his own departure later that day. As I prepared for my meeting in the calm privacy of our bedroom, I reflected on the remarkable transformation of our household dynamics in just a few days. The Henderson team meeting proceeded exceptionally well, with my newly promoted position acknowledged and respected by colleagues who had previously regarded me as simply one among equals. The confidence I brought to the leadership role, undiluted by the domestic tensions that had previously drained my emotional resources, translated to more assertive decision-making and clearer communication. When I returned home mid-afternoon, I found the house transformed. Richard's parents and aunt and uncle had departed, their physical presence removed along with the subtle tensions they had brought. Daniel remained, scheduled for an evening flight, back to his teaching position. The great exodus went smoothly, Daniel reported when I found him and Richard enjoying coffee on the back patio. Mom maintained dignified disapproval until the very end, but Dad seemed almost relieved to be heading home. Richard nodded in agreement. I think he finds these extended family performances exhausting, though he'd never admit it. How did Eleanor's final departure go? I asked, joining them at the table. Richard and Daniel exchanged knowing glances before Richard answered. As expected, a tearful embrace, concerns about when we'll next visit, and a final whispered comment about hoping things stabilize at home. Translated from mom speak, hoping you'll return to accommodating family expectations without question, Daniel clarified with a wry smile. And your response? I asked Richard. That we'd visit when our schedule permits, that they're welcome, to return when we arrange suitable accommodations in advance, and that things at home are stabilizing quite nicely. Thank you. Richard's delivery was matter of fact, but carried unmistakable pride in this establishment of boundaries. We spent the remaining hours before Daniel's departure in surprisingly enjoyable conversation. Without Eleanor's dominating presence, Richard's interaction with his brother revealed a warmth and mutual respect I had rarely observed in their relationship. They reminisced about childhood experiences, discussed Daniel's academic work without Richard's usual dismissive framing, and even made tentative plans for a future visit under more balanced circumstances. As the time approached for Daniel's departure, he pulled me aside while Richard arranged the car service. I wanted to thank you, he said simply. For what? I asked, genuinely curious. For not giving up on my brother when you had every justification to do so, Daniel replied. He's a work in progress. Always has been. But the changes I've seen these past few days suggest he's finally doing the actual work rather than just performing it. The observation was insightful and touched on my own cautious optimism about Richard's transformation. What makes you think it will last? I asked, voicing the question that lingered despite my hopes. Daniel considered this thoughtfully. 3 things. First, he's acknowledging specific behaviors rather than making general apologies. That suggests genuine reflection rather than performative remorse. Second, he's establishing practical systems for change, not just offering emotional reassurance. And third, he smiled slightly, he's finally listening more than he's talking. That's unprecedented in Richard's emotional repertoire. The assessment aligned with my own observations, but carried the additional weight of Daniel's lifelong knowledge of his brother's patterns. I appreciate your perspective, I told him sincerely, and your support during what could have been an even more challenging week. Family systems only change when someone disrupts the established patterns, Daniel observed. You did that by reclaiming your bedroom, a seemingly small action with profound ripple effects. It forced a reckoning that was long overdue, not just for your marriage, but for our entire family dynamic. This framing, that my boundary setting had potential benefits beyond my immediate relationship with Richard, offered a perspective I hadn't fully considered. Perhaps the recalibration of our marriage could influence broader family patterns in positive ways over time. After Daniel's departure, Richard and I found ourselves alone in our home for the first time in days. The absence of his family's physical presence allowed the house to settle back into its natural rhythms, the quiet comfort of spaces designed for our specific preferences rather than performative hosting. I've been thinking about this week, Richard said as we settled in the living room that evening, about what it revealed about our marriage and my understanding of partnership. What conclusions have you reached? I asked, genuinely interested in his perspective now that the immediate crisis had passed. That I've been operating with a fundamental misunderstanding of equity, he replied after a thoughtful pause. I've approached our relationship as though equal claim to benefits could exist without equal assumption of responsibilities, as though my contributions, social, emotional, potential future earnings, somehow balanced your concrete, measurable support of our household. The insight demonstrated a level of self-awareness that felt genuinely new. That's a significant realization, I acknowledged. It's also a painfully obvious one in retrospect, Richard added with a self-deprecating smile. The question now is how to rebuild our partnership on more genuinely equitable terms. The steps you've already initiated are meaningful, I observed. The financial contributions, the division of household responsibilities, the boundaries with your family. But I think the most important shift is in your perception. How so? You're beginning to see my career as central rather than peripheral, I explained. To recognize my professional identity as equally substantive to yours, rather than as a placeholder until some hypothetical future where your business success would take precedence. Richard nodded slowly. I've assumed a traditional family trajectory without ever explicitly discussing it with you. In my mind, your architectural work was important, but ultimately secondary to the family we would build, the social position we would establish, primarily through my eventual business success. The articulation of this unspoken assumption explained so many of the tensions in our marriage, from Richard's dismissive attitude toward my work commitments to his family's consistent undermining of my professional identity. And now? I asked, curious whether this revelation had fundamentally shifted his expectations. Now I recognize that assumption for what it was, a convenient fiction that centered my ambitions while marginalizing yours, Richard acknowledged. The reality is that your career isn't just currently successful. It's structured for sustainable growth in ways mine has never been. Pretending otherwise serves neither of us. The honesty was refreshing, not because it elevated my career above Richard's, but because it acknowledged the objective reality of our professional trajectories without emotional distortion. Where does that leave your business aspirations? I asked, genuinely concerned about his sense of purpose and fulfillment. In need of clear-eyed reassessment, Richard replied. The investment opportunity with Tom Edwards has potential, but I need to approach it realistically rather than as the guaranteed game-changer I've painted it to be. He paused, seeming to consider something carefully before continuing. I'm also contemplating a more significant pivot. What kind of pivot? Daniel suggested I might consider teaching, Richard said, surprising me completely. Using my business experience and MBA in an academic setting rather than continuing to chase investment opportunities that never quite materialize. The potential career shift represented a fundamental reconsideration of how Richard defined success, moving from the high-risk, high-reward world of investment to the more stable, community-oriented environment of education. That's quite a departure from your current path, I observed neutrally, careful not to impose my preferences on his professional decisions. It is, Richard acknowledged, and not one I would have considered even a week ago. But watching Daniel discuss his work, seeing the genuine satisfaction he derives from teaching and mentoring, made me question whether I've been chasing the right definition of success. The willingness to reconsider such a fundamental aspect of his identity suggested the transformative impact of our recent confrontations extended far beyond household arrangements or relationship dynamics. Whatever direction you choose, I support your thoughtful exploration of options, I told him sincerely, just as you're learning to support mine. Richard reached across the space between us, taking my hand gently. Thank you for not giving up on us when you had every justification to do so, he said, unconsciously echoing his brother's earlier words. For creating the disruption necessary for growth, rather than simply accommodating patterns that were slowly destroying both of us. The gratitude felt genuine rather than manipulative, an acknowledgement of my role in catalyzing necessary change rather than an attempt to shift responsibility for our relationship's health entirely to me. Partnership requires both people to participate fully in both the maintenance and the evolution of the relationship, I replied. I'm cautiously optimistic that we're moving toward that balanced participation. As evening settled around us, our home felt truly ours, for perhaps the first time. not in the sense of equal ownership on paper, but in the deeper sense of shared stewardship and mutual respect for each other's place within it. The transformation that had begun with my simple refusal to sleep on the couch continued to unfold in countless small interactions and choices. Richard handling household maintenance tasks without prompting, consulting me about scheduling decisions that affected our shared space, acknowledging my expertise in areas where he had previously dismissed it. The following weeks would test the sustainability of these changes, particularly as we navigated couples counseling and confronted deeper patterns in our relationship. The fundamental power imbalances that had developed over years wouldn't be resolved in days or weeks. Richard's newfound self-awareness would inevitably face challenges as old habits reasserted themselves in moments of stress or insecurity. Yet something essential had shifted, not just in our external arrangements, but in our internal understanding of partnership. The woman who had accepted displacement from her own bedroom had discovered her voice and her boundaries. The man who had casually claimed ownership of spaces he neither maintained nor financially supported had begun the difficult work of genuine accountability. As we prepared for bed that night in our rightfully shared bedroom, I reflected on the unexpected journey of the past week. What had begun as a crisis of physical space had catalyzed a profound reassessment of our entire relationship, from financial contributions to family boundaries, from professional respect to decision-making, authority. The house remained mine on paper, but our home was gradually becoming truly ours in practice, not through Richard's appropriation of my resources, but through his assumption of equal responsibility for their maintenance and care. The revelation of ownership had paradoxically created the conditions for more authentic sharing than had ever existed in our marriage before. "What are you thinking?" Richard asked, noticing my contemplative expression as we settled beneath the covers. "That sometimes the most valuable revelations come from the most uncomfortable confrontations," I replied. "That standing firm in your own truth, even when it creates temporary disharmony, can ultimately lead to more authentic connection than perpetual accommodation ever could." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "The question becomes whether we can maintain that authenticity once the immediate catalyst fades. Whether these changes become our new foundation or simply a temporary adjustment to a specific crisis. That," I agreed, "is the question we'll answer together, one choice at a time, in the days and weeks ahead." As sleep approached, I found myself filled with cautious optimism about our path forward. Not because Richard's transformation was guaranteed to be permanent, but because my own certainly was. The woman who had reclaimed her bedroom had discovered a deeper truth about ownership that extended far beyond physical space. That owning your worth, your boundaries, and your truth creates the foundation for relationships built on mutual respect, rather than convenient imbalance. Whatever the future held for our marriage, that foundation would remain mine to build upon, a revelation worth every moment of discomfort it had required to discover. 2 weeks after Richard's family departed, the patterns of our daily life had begun to establish a new rhythm, one characterized by more conscious collaboration and clearer boundaries. The initial momentum of crisis-driven change had naturally ebbed, revealing which adjustments were superficial reactions and which represented genuine transformation. I observed these distinctions with careful attention as we navigated both our individual professional commitments and our evolving partnership. Richard had maintained his financial contributions to our household expenses, following through on the automatic transfers he had established. More significantly, he had assumed responsibility for several maintenance tasks without prompting, scheduling the seasonal HVAC inspection, handling the quarterly property tax payment, and addressing a minor plumbing issue that would previously have fallen automatically to me. These practical adjustments were encouraging, but it was the subtle shifts in our communication patterns that suggested more fundamental change. Richard had developed a habit of checking in about scheduling decisions that affected our shared space rather than simply announcing them. He expressed genuine interest in my Henderson project progress without immediately connecting it to his own professional activities. When occasional disagreements arose, he worked to address the substantive issues rather than redirecting to emotional manipulation or implied criticism. On a particularly busy Wednesday, I returned home from a full day of client meetings to find Richard in the kitchen preparing dinner. The domestic reversal, him cooking rather than expecting me to handle meal preparation despite my work schedule, represented one of many small but meaningful redistributions of household labor. "How were the Henderson meetings?" he asked as I set down my portfolio case. "Productive but intense," I replied, gratefully accepting the glass of wine he offered. "The sustainability requirements are creating some interesting design challenges, especially given the historical preservation constraints." Rather than offering unsolicited advice or subtly diminishing the complexity of these professional challenges, his typical pattern in the past, Richard simply nodded. "Sounds like exactly the kind of multidimensional problem you excel at solving. Is there anything you need from me tonight? Space to work? A sounding board for ideas?" The question reflected a new awareness of how he could genuinely support my work rather than merely claiming to do so. "Actually, a quiet evening would be helpful. I need to refine some technical specifications before tomorrow's structural engineering review." "Consider it done," Richard promised. "Dinner in 15 minutes, and afterward, I'll handle cleanup while you work." As we sat down to eat, Richard updated me on developments with his investment opportunity, which was proceeding more slowly than initially hoped, but still showing promise, and his exploration of potential teaching positions. "I've scheduled an informational interview with the business department chair at Metropolitan University," he mentioned casually. Daniel made the introduction. "It's not a job interview, just an exploratory conversation about what transitioning to academia might involve." The development surprised me, as Richard had historically dismissed academic careers as lacking the prestige and financial upside he sought. "That's a significant step. What prompted the follow-through?" Richard considered the question thoughtfully. "Several things, really. Watching Daniel discuss his work made me realize I've been dismissive of career paths that don't align with my narrow definition of success. And our recent conversations about contribution versus consumption made me think about what I genuinely enjoy, which is explaining concepts, developing strategies, mentoring others through complex decisions," he replied with a self-awareness that felt refreshingly genuine. "The aspects of business I've always found most satisfying aren't necessarily the highest compensated ones. Teaching might allow me to focus on those elements while providing more stability than constant entrepreneurial pursuit." The potential pivot represented a fundamental reassessment of priorities that aligned with our recent relationship recalibration. Rather than chasing elusive business opportunities that promised spectacular returns but delivered consistent disappointment, Richard was considering a path that offered more modest financial rewards, but greater personal satisfaction and consistency. "I think it's worth exploring," I encouraged. "You've always been an excellent communicator and strategist. Those skills would translate well to teaching." After dinner, true to his word, Richard handled the kitchen cleanup while I retreated to my office to work on the Henderson specifications. The quiet productivity of the evening, each of us focused on our respective responsibilities without resentment or scorekeeping, embodied the partnership we were working to build. Later that night, as we prepared for bed, Richard brought up our upcoming couples counseling appointment scheduled for the following evening. We had attended 2 sessions already, beginning the challenging process of examining the patterns that had created our relationship imbalance. "I've been thinking about something Dr. Martinez asked in our last session," Richard said, as he folded laundry that he had handled without prompting. "About how our backgrounds shaped our expectations of partnership." Dr. Martinez was the therapist we had selected from Richard's initial research, a straightforward but compassionate counselor who specialized in relationship power dynamics. "Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.